who's owned a public accounting firm here in Virginia Beach since 1992. He's a long history of community involvement. He's served on numerous boards and committees, including the Virginia Beach Community Services Board and the Hampton Roads Chamber of Commerce. He currently is a board member for the Virginia Beach Education Foundation, serving on the Finance and Grant Review Committees, the School Board Audit Committee, the Virginia Beach Process Improvement Committee, and the Deferred Compensation Board. He's a very busy man. Additionally, he was named the School Division's 2007-2008 Central Office Volunteer of the Year. He holds a bachelor's degree in accounting from Dominican College of Lawville in Orangeburg, New York. Among his accomplishments, Mr. Brunke lists his work as CPA, his experience as a youth softball coach, and most importantly, his work as father and husband. Mr. Brunke, thank you.
Listening to that list, I just got tired. Wow. Thank you for having me out here this morning. I was out here last year. We had the opportunity to review what was a much more exciting budget season. There was a lot of things going on last year. I have to say that this year is not nearly as exciting from the standpoint of issues that are generating a lot of interest. I think the budget situation this year is relatively benign, and we're going to go through that. Last year I did bring the PowerPoint, did the whole PowerPoint thing, and realized I don't think we got past the first screen last year. As I go, I don't have a specific outline of point, and everybody wait till the end to ask questions. I want it to be more conversational, so as we're going through, I'll make sure that we stay on pace so I cover everything I want to cover. But feel free, if you have a question as I'm going through, just throw up your hand and we'll try to make sure that we address it while it's relevant to the discussion, rather than trying to hold off to the end. When you run for school board, people ask, why you're running for school board, and people give you all kinds of different reasons. But I think deep down, one thing you have to have is a passion for public education. You have to believe in the virtues of public education, the virtues as outlined and defined 200 plus years ago by our founding fathers, and the establishment and the recognition of the importance that an educated electorate plays in the continuation of our country and our society. And you have to understand and appreciate that the opportunity to gain access to education through the public means is really the only opportunity that a lot of people ever have. Speaking for myself, I can tell you right now, if there wasn't a public school, I wouldn't have gone to school. There was no way my folks would have been able to have 2 nickels to scrape together to put me into anything else other than some homegrown version of education. Yes, sir?
Just out of curiosity, approximately what percentage of the population is going to private schools?
You know what, I honestly don't know the answer to that question. It's not something anybody's ever asked me. But I will tell you, as you know, we have, in our school system, for example, we have 86 schools with 70,000 students. There are a number of private schools, but I wouldn't guess if I just had to speculate, looking at your local parochial schools, your Cape Henry, and some of those, a couple thousand students maybe. That's speculation, so you wouldn't quote me on that if I had to try to create some context to that. But public schools, we're expected at its core to teach people how to read, write, and become productive members of society. And the school day and the school year has been pretty static for a very long time. But something that's happened over the past 100 years is what was a very basic requirement to schools has been expanded. And it's not expanded because necessarily your local school board asks for this expansion, but it's because we're asked to do things as a local school board to help address some of the issues and ills of society. And over the past 100 years, there have been 85 new initiatives that have been placed on public schools. 85 new initiatives. There are 85 things during the course of the school day that we are now responsible to do. And I'm not saying that they're good or bad. This is a factual discussion about the allocation of time. And we take that pie and we divide that time. And for those of you who are in our school system and teaching, you'll know, if you've been in the system for any length of time, there are things you're doing today that you didn't do when you first started teaching, whether it is reporting or otherwise. Now, of those 85, I'll tell you, 50 of them, as I count them, have occurred in the last 20 to 25 years. And again, I'm not going to suggest that they aren't worthy. That's another debate we can have. My point is to simply highlight that there are things that when you all went to school wasn't part of your school day. There are things that when I went to school wasn't part of my school day.
You say some of the things that you're referring to.
Some of the things we're referring to. Let's just start with some of the early things that we take very much for granted today. I don't think anybody would want to give up, but one of the first things to come about is mandatory school transportation, something we take very much for granted. We have a discussion a little bit later. You're going to recognize that it's not something the state necessarily considers to be a vital part of public education, because they don't include it in its basic formula for public education. We introduced kindergarten, something we didn't do in the early days. School lunch programs, something that's expanded over the years. We have driver's education. Now, many of us in this room probably think driver's education is part of school, but if you went to school before the 1950s, driver education wasn't part of your school day. It was something that occurred outside of your school. Sex education is something that's been brought into the school system as well that wasn't part of our day. Head Start, adult education, consumer education, teaching folks how to be good consumers, part of the decision-making process that wasn't there. Something else that we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about high school schedule, for example, is the introduction of a personal finance and economics course, somewhat what I would refer to as almost a knee-jerk reaction to a financial meltdown 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. The answer was, well, folks don't know what they're doing with their finances, so we need to educate them. So we carved out and created these separate courses. Well, the fact of the matter is these items and these bullet points in these courses were already included in many of our existing courses as being built in. But we start going through the list: drug and alcohol prevention, abuse, parenting education, character education, women's studies, African American heritage education, school breakfast programs. That's in addition to your school lunch programs. Variety of teen pregnancy programs. Expansion of preschool programs for working parents, stranger danger education, anti-smoking education, child abuse monitoring, and I'm only reading a handful of the items that are on the list. As we go into the 1990s, we start getting into things like HIV education, death and grieving education, something we have to do, the expansion of computer and internet education, something that in the 1950s and 60s you didn't contemplate, something today that would have to be part. Again, so my point is not that these items, not that these items aren't important. That's another debate we can have about things that are now added on the plate of public education. High school dropout gang education, bus safety education, anti-harassment education, and the latest one is body mass index monitoring. That's part of it. So that's just an example. There's 85 of them. And again, I don't want to suggest that because I read any one item or didn't read another item that I agree that should be there or shouldn't be there. We can have that debate in another discussion. I bring that up because it is part of what drives our school budget. It's part of what drives the cost of education. It is part of what drives the time that's required on the part of our teachers to be able to teach them how to read, write, arithmetic, the basic 3 items that we always kind of fall back on. And those things are taking up time. And you had a question over here.
How many of those are either federal or state funded or unfunded mandates?
Many of them are federally mandated. Some of them are funded. Some of them aren't funded. I'd have to go through the list and tick and tie every one. There's no blanket answer to that. There's a variety of them. And yes, here.
Just out of curiosity, probably about what percentage of those are due to the lack of parental responsibility?
You know, that's a great question, because one of the things that I often come across is when we're in this age of adequate yearly progress, we start labeling schools as failing schools, something I mentioned last year, No Child Left Behind, a very well-intentioned piece of legislation that was just severely misguided. It basically, as I used the analogy last year, is dragging good trains, it's a train dragging good schools off a cliff, because it marches you towards this idealistic goal that 100% absolutely is going to meet every benchmark. And this school system has 2,600 something different benchmarks that it has to meet. And eventually you get to the point that if you're not at 100%, you are, quote, a failing school. And people ask, why are your schools failing? And I answer the question, and particularly within our own district. I think we have a great district here in the Beach, because you have these schools that some folks will point to and say, I don't want my child going to that school because that school's not good. You know what? That school's great. That school has the same resources as a school that everybody else wants to go to. They have the same teachers, they have the same resources, they have the same administration, they have the same support by the school. We don't have failing schools. We have failing neighborhoods and failing families. And that is a challenge. That is yet another discussion. But the fact of the matter is, when a child walks through our door, they are an innocent 5-year-old kid who deserves every opportunity as a society that we can do to help make that kid successful. I am not willing personally to turn my back on a 5-year-old because somebody's parent didn't do what I may expect. So that creates this list of things that we have to start to do to support. And that's another debate we can have about failing communities and failing families. My job is they come through the door, and I want to make sure that that child has access to great quality public education, and I'll tell you they do. And I used this analogy last year, and I use it as often as I can. I ask you, when the child walks through the door, what are they carrying with them? What is the weight that they're bringing from their home that's preventing them from really being able to be successful in school? And we need to do, as a community, what we can do to help relieve those obligations, because these are kids. And no 6-year-old kid asked to be homeless. It's something that happened to them. As adults, we can talk about this all day long, about why it happens and all that stuff. I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent. So, yeah, these things come about for a variety of different reasons, and again, we could have another session about why they're there. My point is these are things that our teachers are asked to do every day, and we have that pie, that traditional pie, and it's only but so big, and every time we start taking a piece out of that pie, the things that we fall back on as our core become less and less and less. So I just wanted to kind of lay that as a foundation when we talk about our school and our budget and some of the things we're going to be doing. Since the last time when we spoke, there's really been 2 initiatives that the school system, there's lots of things we do all the time, but 2 significant initiatives that we're undertaking that I think are important to highlight and also have some impact on our budget in the current year. The first issue is the high school schedule. For some of you, you may know that there was an extended discussion about what the high school schedule should look like. I've been an advocate of addressing our high school schedule since before I've been on the board. The reason I've been an advocate of addressing the high school schedule is because to earn an advanced diploma, it requires 26 credit hours now. Our high school schedule, if you wanted to take a lunch, only allowed for 24 credit hours, which means that you had to get high school credit in middle school in order to be able to graduate with an advanced diploma. I think that's a challenge. Not everybody, well, most of our kids today are coming in to high school with a number of high school credits. They're taking keyboarding, which when we went to school is called typing. That's a high school credit. A lot of them are taking Algebra 1. Some of them are taking Earth Science. Some of them are taking a language. So there are plenty of opportunities in middle school to earn high school credits. But again, not every child is in that place. And we also have children that are moving into the area as well, and those folks also. So one of the challenges I had was how can we have a high school schedule that doesn't allow a student to earn an advanced diploma in his high school years without skipping lunch? That was really pushed even further by the introduction of the requirement for a personal finance and economics course that became a required course that wasn't there just a couple of years ago, as well as an additional requirement for online courses. There frankly was too much pressure being placed on our high school schedule. We had too many kids going through the day and not taking lunch. And I don't know about you, but I can't start my day at 7:25 in the morning and go all the way through to 2 o'clock without a break, without a lunch. So for me personally, it was something I think that needed to be addressed, and the rest of the board agreed that that needed to be addressed. There were a number of options. We talked about some 4x4 options and things of that sort. Another component of the high school schedule that came up, in addition to the issues we had with just the good old-fashioned block scheduling, was the schedule of a high school teacher. Was also part of this discussion. High school teachers are required to teach 5 courses. During the course of the day, currently, there are 8. That's 5 courses over 2 days. Our school days are blocked. 4 days, four blocks on an A day and 4 blocks on a B day. So a total A, B day is a total of 8 blocks. 6 of those blocks are instructional blocks. 2 of those blocks are for lunch and study block on continuing days. So a high school teacher is required to teach 5 blocks over the course of 2 days, which meant that on, let's say it was an A day, a high school teacher had 90 minutes of time for lunch and planning, and then on the B day had 3 hours of time, 180 minutes for lunch and planning. So over the course of the 2 days, it worked out to 4.5 hours for lunch and planning, and that was something that was very inconsistent with the time that was allotted for other levels of schools as well. So there were some budget issues that were coming up in the high school schedule as well. We ended up moving to a modified AV, modified block. People have different terms for it, but basically what we have now are eight instructional sections over a 2-day period with a 30-minute lunch on each day. And high school teachers will be teaching 6 classes. Now, one of those classes may be a study block, but they will be responsible for students in some manner, either as a teacher instructing a class or as overseeing a study block for a total of 6 classes. So we did make adjustments to the high school schedule. There are some other benefits to it. There are some opportunities for a 4x4 thread for some credit recovery for folks who have struggled in particular classes, an opportunity to do some credit recovery. The other very significant thing that occurred this past year, yeah?
Was there any consideration of just extending the day some, a half an hour?
We did extend.
An hour to get that additional time?
We did extend the day in part to accommodate the new opportunity for 8 instructional blocks plus the lunch. The day was expanded by a total of 14 minutes. It was expanded 14 minutes with, I believe, it was 5 of those minutes or in the morning and 9 of those minutes in the afternoon or something to that effect, which then had a ripple effect on middle school and elementary school because of the busing schedules and things of that sort. So even your middle schools now are on a slightly different schedule as a result of the high school schedule, and even some of the elementary schools as well. Yeah?
Could you combine a couple of those classes? You said you had to have an internet class and you had to have an economic class. Could that be an internet class on economics?
They're separate courses.
Well, okay, when you do an internet class, what is it on?
Well, it's just an online course.
An online course, it's not on a requirement like economics, it's on a non-requirement.
You know, I'll have to tell you, I don't know precisely what classes are covered underneath that particular requirement. I know as it was presented to us, they were presented as 2 clearly separate and distinct additions to the school day.
Are we basically talking about just high school?
That is high, yeah. I'm just talking about high school on the schedule because that's really the significant thing that occurred during the past year. The other very significant thing we did was, and we talked about this some last year, there is a new funding formula for the schools. For years and years, 15 years, we had what ultimately was the 51.3% of a limited number of revenue streams went to schools. That process, as we know and discussed last year, had been undermined for a number of years, and it was argued that it was not dynamic enough to address certain changes in state funding, in student enrollment, and also wasn't broad enough and created this division between, let's call it, tourist-oriented tax dollars and real estate-oriented tax dollars. The new funding formula that was put in place is an expanded base of tax revenues that the school system participates in, which I think, personally speaking, is better. It is dynamic in that it first addresses the local requirement for education. That is the inverse side of what the state funds for SOQ, and we'll get into what SOQ is in a little bit. So basically what this formula does now is it identifies the revenue streams that are eligible for splitting between schools and city. It then identifies the locally required contribution to public education as defined by the state, carves that out and puts it over there. That number is dynamic because it is enrollment sensitive and it is local composite index sensitive, which we discussed last year, and I'll cover that again as a refresher in a few minutes. Then, after that's carved out, the remaining revenues, I think it's 31.3 some odd %, come to the schools. If you don't like the funding formula, you're not going to like this one or any other one. I happen to be an advocate of the funding formula. I think the funding formula has served our city well over the years until it was undermined. I think this funding formula is much better. It's dynamic. It addresses some of the concerns that council has and kind of reestablishes a base. And I'll tell you, I personally think it's a good thing. There's very little bickering right now between the school board and council, as there had been for the past couple of years when the funding formula was undermined. Because honestly, and again, this is my opinion, I'm not speaking for the board here, just this is me speaking. When you do away with the funding formula, we talk about a needs-based budget, and there's a lot of merit to that discussion. And I know a couple of the councilmen who are frequent guests here are absolutely advocates of a needs-based budget. I'll tell you, there's 11 people on our board. And I will go around our board and I will ask everybody what our school system needs. And we'll talk about that a little later too. And I will get 11 definitions of need. And our $680 million budget will turn into a $1 billion request by the time we get done with everybody's needs. So the funding formula, while it removes some of that need-based discussion, and I'll come back to that, it kind of establishes a framework in which the school system has to work and live in. And in 2008, for example, our school budget was $721 million. That was 2008. This is now 2013, going into a 2014 year, and our budget is $680 million. Why did that happen? That happened because we had a funding formula in place that defined and constrained the dollars that our school system is going to have to work with. And those dollars were a finite number of dollars. In our school system, our superintendent led this process. I'll tell you, he is the one out front saying, I'm not telling you I can't do this. I'm going to show you how I can make this work. It's not always popular, and it's not always easy. But he leads that process, and our board is right there with him. And you make the necessary adjustments to work within a budget. And that's what the funding formula did. Without that funding formula, in year number 2, when it was $721 million, without a funding formula, I guarantee you, everybody on that board would have come back and said, well, we need $720 million plus all these extra inflationary kickers. So the funding formula creates, this is me speaking, creates a framework and a constraint in which the school board works. Now, if there is something that we truly need, we have the option, as a school system, to go to City Council and request additional monies in the form of a tax increase. I think that's a great responsibility. It tells us as a board that you better really, really believe in what you're asking for, because you're not asking City Council. You are asking for a tax increase. So that's the kicker in the formula. It's not so constrained that we can't do things that are, quote, of need, if in fact we define that there are some things of need. And we'll talk about one of those items, I think, that's going to come up this coming year that'll be this discussion. So that option's available. So in summary, 2 big things that happened this past year as we lead into the budget: the funding formula and the high school schedule. Now, our current budget, and I'm going to refer to this page, the short full at a glance. Most of y'all have it on your table. Yes?
Before you go there,
Yeah.
I'll ask you a question, please.
Of course.
The persons that you are advocates for, your board, are persons who can't vote. They're students, by and large.
Yes.
City councils, who they advocate for, are basically business. Taxpayers finance both of them. So, who is doing the advocacy for the children? Because what they need to be functional in a global economy is to have that ability to think and reason on a global level. So who's doing, before you start your budget,
Yeah.
who's advocating for them?
Our board does, and the types of tools that you're referring to are deeply embedded throughout our entire strategic plan that's titled Compass of 2015. You can find that on our school board website. That is well underway, and the whole process that we've been doing for 5 years, and frankly, I think doing well, because we're being recognized nationally by many school districts as a model for how you introduce and redesign your instruction towards critical thinking, collaboration, globalization, all of the things you were just referring to. We've been doing that for about 4 years, 4.5 years. We're being recognized nationally as doing it very well. And I say that because we are constantly referred to as a district to look to as a model on how to do this on a large scale. There are small systems that do. There are small systems that are nimble. You know, if you've got 1,000 kids, they can do all kinds of things that we can't do with 70,000 kids and that very diverse population group and diverse group of needs. So the board advocates for them. One of the questions we always, or at least myself, I always ask for is, what is in the best interest of our student? And that's the direction that I will always go, and what is in the best interest of our student. Now, advocating for them may require additional resources. If it does, we have the option to ask for those resources. I hope I've answered your question. Okay. Our budget this year, relatively benign. There are a couple of small carryovers from last year, you know, coming out of the box. And this may be a good chance to take just a minute, to talk about the local composite index. If you recall last year, one of the items that has been nagging the school system for years is that the required local participation by the city had increased by about $30 million over a over a 6-year period. But there were no adjustments that were made to the local funding, and that was one of the inherent flaws of the old funding formula, that it didn't adjust for changes in local requirements. It was only dynamic to changes in dollars. The city allocated and found $20 million of that $30 million for the school system and plugged that into our budget on an ongoing basis. They plugged the remaining $10 million with a one-time funding from their reserve fund that worked out to be about $9.2 million. So that $9.2 million we know coming out of last year's budget was going to be a hole because it was one-time money that the city gave us. The second hole that we faced coming out of the budget was an $11 million number that we used our own reversion funds. Reversion funds are dollars that are left over at the end of the year that are generally used for purchasing of things like buses and equipment and whatnot. We turned around and plugged those dollars back into our operating budget. So coming out of last year's budget, we knew we were going to be looking at about $19 to $20 million out of the box in terms of a shortfall, just going year to year on a flat budget. And again, a flat budget does not take into consideration increased fuel costs, increased utility costs, and things of that nature. And when you have a system where 85% of your costs are personnel costs, that doesn't address any changes in personnel costs either. So just to go flat year to year, we were looking at $20 million with no changes. By the time everything was said and done, the superintendent's estimate of needs came in at $680 million. That's the total revenue number. When we take last year's budget and adjust for the inflationary components and whatnot, we came in at $696 million. So that left us with what is generally referred to as your budget shortfall. The difference between your projected revenues and your baseline expenditures adjusted for inflation. And that adjusted for inflation did not include compensation adjustments for teachers, or any staff for that matter. Okay? So that's $15.9 million that we were short. And if we know already, as I just outlined, that almost $20 million of that we knew coming out of the box because we had one-time money from last year. We were doing a little bit better than we had anticipated, but we were still $15 million short. So the $15 million shortage this year was relatively easy to address. There's nothing really exciting here. We have roughly $8 million that is being adjusted because of changes in student enrollment. We have a drop of about 700 students. So we're addressing changes in student enrollment. We also have some adjustments included in that $8 million that are related to an ongoing early retirement incentive that has been in place for a number of years, which has reduced the overall compensation level, because when somebody retires, they're retiring with X number of years experience, and a new teacher's coming in at something less than that. There is a 5% non-personnel expenditure reduction across the board. That's $3.5 million. Now, 5% has to be added to the adjustments that have been made in the previous years to that same line item. And in total, the number is now over 13% of non-personnel related reductions in the past few years. There is an adjustment to secondary class size by a quarter of a student. Secondary class size includes middle school, high school. That's $1.7 million. Now, let's not dance around what that means. That means larger class size because we have fewer teachers. That quarter student is $1.7 million and would be addressed through attrition. The adjustment to the high school schedule I referred to earlier, and the schedule of a high school teacher, that produced $1.1 million in savings. And again, let's not dance around that subject. We save $1.1 million because high school teachers are now going to be required to have more instructional classes, more classes, which means you need less teachers. That's $1.1 million. And then there's another several $100,000 plus in the elimination of 6 to 10 central office positions. Now, when you do reductions, you want to ask yourself and make sure that the reductions you're making are having the least impact on students. And when you go through the list of different options, some of this impacts students. When you adjust the high school class size, that impacts students because you have more students in a classroom. You have more students in a classroom, that is more students for a teacher to be responsible for. If you're an English teacher, if you're a high school AP English teacher, oh, I've got one over there. Is that I'm a high school English teacher?
No, I'm not a high school. I would never.
Okay. Was that a question?
I know what I was like. No.
I just saw the hand fly up.
I just want to know what you're saying about maximum class sizes that you think would be the increase. How many students are you talking about in a classroom?
Well, it's going to vary from school to school and class to class. You can't divide it up exactly, but generally speaking, the number. Gosh, I can look it up in the book, the exact numbers, because we have different caps for different classes at different levels. But it's in the general. Yeah, it's generally. See, I'm a CPA. I have to qualify everything and be very specific. Sorry. It's generally speaking, if you'll accept a general answer, and I'll get you the very specific one I look at, is in the lower to middle 20s to like the 25. Well, you will find classes, as I said that, and I will find teachers that will have 30 in their classes. And we will find some that end up with 16, 17, 18 in their classes. It's the nature of scheduling. But on average, it's in the lower 20s at the high school level.
Does the fact that school is seen as an academy with a certain subject matter, are they treated equally in terms of how many students are in those classes?
Yes. There is not a separate policy to address class size caps for academy students versus non-academy students.
But is the implementation of it done irregardless of policy? So if I went into the school, the Princess Anne, the one that's the
IB program?
Yes. I'm going to find the same thing if I go to Kempsville or one of the other schools? On
average, yes. On average. You could walk into any one class, again, because of the uniqueness of scheduling and the number of students in a particular building, and you just can't divide them all up evenly. So you can walk into any one class and find some variation. And for those of you in the room that are teachers, you'll know that some years you're going to have 25, and some years you're going to have 19, and on the really bad years you end up with 30. And it's challenging. I mean, it's quite an exercise putting together a master schedule for a high school class for 2,500 students to move through 7 to 8 bells. It's complicated, but they're your averages. So when we talk about a quarter student, what that says, and the way that works in class size, we look at the total number of students and we start dividing those numbers out and we give an allocation to the school and say, you're allowed X number of teachers for these particular subject matters or grades. Yes?
Yeah, I'll just,
And you can bring the insight.
The way I experience it at the middle school level
Yeah.
is the higher level of courses, the algebras and that, have the greater number of students. It's the lower level with the special needs students and the students who are inclusion in that, they are the ones that have the lower class size.
Yes, and you will also see some of that from school to school, from certain Title I schools, particularly at the elementary level. Your Title I schools versus your non-Title I schools, you'll see significant differences in class size there, because there are Title I initiatives to reduce class size in your Title I schools.
So I always enjoy your presentations, but the devil is in the details.
It is. It is.
And I can understand as a CPA, and then you come in to give this, but we need a little bit of that devilish details.
I'm not sure if there's a
You
question there.
understand me? You're giving us the broad.
Yes.
But so we can be advocates, and we can, look at, because we're the Taxpayer Alliance, we need a little bit more so that we can go ahead and do that independent research based on what you've told us.
You'll find 2 documents on our website, because today's environment doesn't allow me to get into all those details and qualifications. So based on that, I'm going to point you to 2 documents where you can review these for yourself. One is the superintendent's estimate of needs. It's on the school board website, and you'll find that under budget. The second is and a more comprehensive document is the school board comprehensive annual financial report as audited by Cherry Becker Holland. That is also on the school board website, and that contains a very, very detailed level of what the actual numbers are. And then, in terms of what our policies are, on the school board website again, you will find very specific school board policies that address class size caps and class size floors. We do have floors as well. If you don't get to a certain number of students for a class, the class doesn't make and you don't go. And again, Carolyn, there are going to be exceptions to that, because you'll walk into an accounting 2 class and find 6 kids, where our high school floor is 15. Why will you do that? Because when we have classes that offer succession and the opportunity for a second class, we don't deny the child who started the program to be able to not finish the program. So there are rules that deal with that.
That's the devilish details that I'm talking about. So people can understand exactly, if you start a child, and that's the purpose of education, that's the purpose of the pre-kindergarten, so by the 12th grade. So by the time they get to the 12th grade, and like you said, many already have college credits.
Yeah.
But if the taxpayer does not understand why they need to look at what's going on in the elementary school, no matter where they come in contact with this system with their child, then they're not going to know what to do and how to make sure that their dollars are spent properly and in best interest of that child. And what you're giving us today is great, but for someone who didn't know, they wouldn't know how to access to go in so that they can build upon the knowledge that you're imparting to us.
Sure, I can appreciate that. And if we have topics in the future that we really want to dive into in detail when it's not budget season, I'd be happy to come back and address those types of things specifically. Today, trying to provide you an overview of where our budget is, some direction to where you can find some very specific answers to the detailed questions that, I don't want to stand up right now and start going through the book and flipping out those numbers, because unfortunately I just don't have every single cap committed to my memory. But let's move on. Our budget was, again, just recapping, was $19 million short. It was relatively benign in how we addressed those. Again, it had to do with retirement programs, reduction in student population, 5% cuts across the board, an adjustment to the class size, high school schedule changes. Those are the main things that happened. So, if that's the case, and we have a budget right now that's sitting at $680 million, that's where our current budget is sitting. What are the remaining issues we're going to be dealing with? What is the question that the school board is going to be addressing as we wrap up this budget and present it to City Council. We should be voting on the budget. It's either, I think it's March 5th. We have one more workshop coming up. I believe today the General Assembly will be finalizing its work. It's supposed to finalize its work, so we'll get some direction. Here's the thing I haven't talked about yet that is honestly the biggest issue we're dealing with for the rest of the budget cycle. If y'all remember back in December, the governor rolled out his budget. And one of the things the governor threw on the table, and it made for a very attractive headline, and that was that the governor was providing funding for a 2% compensation adjustment for teachers. If y'all remember that, that was part of the governor's budget. I'm sorry? It's still out there. It's the governor's budget. That's his proposal. There's proposals in the House. There's proposals in the Senate. There's a variety of them. But it started with the governor's proposal for a 2% compensation adjustment for teachers. So I'm going to take a step back for a second, because in order to understand what that really means to Virginia Beach, we need to understand something called SOQ. Now, the 2% number on the headline again,
And what again, please?
SOQ, standards of quality. The headline makes it sound real straightforward. Governor, state, giving 2% raises. Pretty benign. Now, let's step back for a second and talk about something called SOQ. I think it's important that everybody in this room understand what standards of quality SOQ means. Standards of quality, SOQ, is the model in which the state uses to define basic education, minimum educational requirements for Virginia schools. It has, I refer to it as a model SOQ school. How many teachers per student do we need? What are the relationships for high school, elementary school? How much should those teachers be paid? What is the average experience of those teachers in the classroom? It has this very complex, theoretical idea of what minimum education should look like in Virginia. That's referred to as SOQ. And then there's a cost for that school. That school is that SOQ is then extrapolated around the entire state, and then the state funds, SOQ funding, funds public education to the extent of what that minimum SOQ school would look like. Okay? So we have the state defining what public education looks like, the state defining what it thinks that should cost, and then the state putting the money into public education. So, when the governor says, I'm increasing teacher compensation by 2%, what that means is he is looking at the compensation component of the cost of SOQ. In other words, what are we paying a teacher in our model? And increasing it by 2%. Now, what we have to understand is what happens, A, when we actually get down to the locality. The first thing you want to know is there is not a single school district in the Commonwealth that runs its school at an SOQ level. You wouldn't send your kid there. It does not include some of the very basic things we come to expect. There's a little bit of irony here because I listed it earlier on one of the things we now do. SOQ, for example, doesn't include public transportation of students to school. Yellow school buses, the drivers for those buses. Doesn't pay for it. I'm sorry?
The fuel.
Fuel, whatever. It does not, SOQ does not include transportation. SOQ, getting back to what you were talking about earlier, SOQ says class sizes will be a certain level. Virginia Beach says class sizes are going to be here. So what does that mean? That means that if they say it takes X number of teachers for 1,000 students, we say in Virginia Beach, we're going to have X number of teachers plus however many more. So, It does not include support positions, data support specialists in a school. The Lord will tell you there are so many requirements for data analysis, important analysis in the schools. We have positions in schools that are critically important to running our schools and meeting the requirements of federal agencies that just aren't funded in SOQ. So the first thing you need to understand is that SOQ is not a school you would send your child to. It doesn't include high school sports. It doesn't include after-school activities. That would include your SCA or your high school football team. That would include your marching band or your We the People competitions at the middle school level. These are all things that we've come to expect as a community are part of a quality program in our city. So, let's talk about that 2% raise again and come back to that. Approximately, that 2%, the number of employees covered under SOQ only represents about 40% of the true cost of personnel for our city. So, that very first piece, 2% compensation adjustment for staff in Virginia Beach, it's about $5 million per percentage point. $5 million per percentage point, 2 percentage points. That means $10 million is the cost to Virginia Beach to institute a 2% pay raise. So if we have a $10 million number and come back to what the governor's proposal was, and it's very close to the House proposal, the Senate's a little different. If only 40% of that's being covered, the first thing that tells you is that's $4 million of the raise, of the compensation adjustment. There's $6 million the city of Virginia Beach has to come up with in order to do that. Now, it gets more interesting. Because SOQ is the total cost. The state recognizes and says we are in partnership with the locality in providing public education. We don't pay 100% of your cost. We are only going to pay a certain percentage. And what percentage it pays is going to be determined by how it evaluates the locality's ability to pay for its own public education. And in Virginia Beach, it has been determined that our ability to pay for public education is 41.1%. So what does that mean? That means when we look at that $4 million, the state isn't giving us $4 million. They're leaving 41.1% out because that's our responsibility. So now we start doing this math. I'm down to $2.6 million. Bottom line, that's a very long way. Trying to give you all of the details on that one. A very long way, an explanation to tell you that a 2% raise for employees in the City of Virginia Beach's public school system is going to cost $10 million. And the governor's proposal for a 2% raise will provide $2.6 million. That means we have $7.4 million we have to come up with locally.
So that means you're going to raise your taxes to cover that?
There are some. There are some that may want to do that. That is the discussion.
What do you mean by that? Who's the some?
I haven't taken a poll. I just know that there are some people around my table at the board that would probably go that direction.
Yeah. Not the people that are actually giving you the money.
Oh no. That's different. That's different.
Thank you.
All right, you lost my train of thought. All right, 2 point. Okay, that is the discussion at our next workshop. We'll get some decision today. One of the things we as a system are hoping for is that money could be applied to the compensation adjustments we did last year, and that we could look at that state funding as its share of the raises we did last year, because the raises from last year were 100% paid by the city with no participation by the state.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If the state, if a budget's passed and it says there's a 2% raise from teachers, which really is less than 1/2 of 1% that the state's going to fund, does that require the city to make up the difference and make that raise happen?
Okay. If the school board decides to pursue the state compensation adjustment raise of 2%, then the city would have to do that. The school does not have to embrace that 2%. And there's your debate on Tuesday at our school board workshop.
You know, you're competing with a finite amount of dollars towards things like light rail and other things other than, so what you're doing is everybody wants a piece of us, okay? And we only have so much to give.
Absolutely.
But it's by force. In other words, if I don't pay my taxes, I own my home, but they'll come and take my home. So there, I will have no choice in the matter when you guys make those decisions. Just remember that.
I do. I do remember that. The debate that we're going to have. Now, let me address how this can be done. This can be one. Yes, sir.
Before you jump into that,
Yeah.
something wrong with tangent. The budget proposal for next year already includes a 2.5% teacher increase. Now, most of that's going to offset the VRS changes.
Yes.
Isn't there also another 0.5% that was going towards it?
There are some required adjustments in the budget. The General Assembly last year or 2 years ago mandated a 401k type, an elective deferral, basically a required elective deferral, so I guess it's a mandatory deferral, of 5% of employee compensation to VRS. And there was a phase-in period of 5 years where you could do 1% of that per year. And along with that comes a compensating adjustment so that the net ends up coming pretty close to zero, except for adjusting for payroll taxes. So some of those adjustments are in the budget, and there was some dollars in the budget from the state that were assumed, but we were assumed to have 100% offset. That's kind of old news at this point from the time that we published the budget, because it's become clearer to us that we do not have flexibility in how to use those dollars. So and that clarity came after the superintendent's estimate of needs were issued. So at this point in time...
So that raise wouldn't count for the SOQ?
No. Now, if we accept... Yes?
Quick question. In terms of that state monies, because we got a memo that came out via the superintendent's office that if we don't accept that money from the state, it's never to be there again.
That's correct.
That's
correct.
Okay.
So let me jump into what our options are, okay? Our options are a couple. Option number one, leave the money on the table. Do not take the state money. Do not make an adjustment to teacher compensation or anybody's compensation for that matter. And leave the budget where it is right now. And yes, that is a one-time situation in which if we opt not to take the money, we will never have the opportunity to take that money again. Now, I will editorialize. I'm not speaking for the board here. I'm going to editorialize for a moment. Some people will look at that 2 point something million and calculate that out as an incredible annuity that will pay dividends for years and years and years to come because we'll continually receive that money. And then when I hear that, I do then turn around and ask this question. There is the other side of that annuity, which also is recurring, and that's $7.6 million out of the city money every year also. So I'm not sure how some people are going to reconcile that. Let me get through the options first. So option one, leave the money on the table. Do not take it. Means we do not have to match city dollars. It's done. We'll never get the money again. But then again, we don't have to come up with the $7.6 million every year. Option number two, and again, some of this is going to be dictated by what happens up in the General Assembly today. Option number two is take the money and look at $7.6 million of additional local funding by making additional cuts. What types of additional cuts will we make? Some of these items were rolled out at our last budget workshop. They're going to include much more significant adjustments to class size. They would include the elimination of certain activities. They would include reduced overall additional cost reductions. I have that list here. There's a long list of them. The most significant one that jumped out off the table was class size adjustments and elimination of a variety of activities. So let's think about what that really means. So we accept the 2% raise, and we give a 2% compensation adjustment to staff. But you do that by basically eliminating enough staff so that you can take all their salaries and redivvy it up among the remaining folks. And those who remain will now have a larger class size in return for that. I'm not personally sure that's a really good plan. I'm not convinced that eliminating the number of positions required and increasing class size by the amount required is a good trade-off. The second thing that can happen, and somebody referenced this before, is a school board could take the simple way out and not do any work at all. And it could just simply say, we're going to take this money, and City Council, we're going to ask you for more money and go ask for a tax increase, whatever you have to do. I'm not personally going to do that, I assure you that. There may be some folks on the board, who would be inclined to do that. Nobody specifically come out and said that. That's a discussion that's going to happen on Tuesday. That's Tuesday's workshop. That is the big issue remaining for our budget season. That debate and those options are as they sit today at 9:30, whatever time it is in the morning. They may change by the time we get to Monday morning, because the ultimate reconciliation of the House version budget from the governor and the Senate may come out with something entirely different. So as it stands right now, option A, do nothing. Option B,